Glory Cloud Podcast, episode 180. Well, stay tuned for finding Christ in Ruth this week. Well, welcome back to another episode of the Glory Cloud Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Cahy, and I'm joined by our co-host, Pastor Todd Bordeaux of Cornerstone Orthodox Presbyterian Church in Houston, Texas. How are you doing, Todd?
I'm doing well. Very excited to get into the book of Ruth tonight.
Yeah, me too. This is, it's a short book, but a rich story.
Yep.
All right. Well, I will just briefly run through our regular housekeeping, reminding our listeners that we do have our show notes page over at meredithkline.com/podcast. There you can find all of the resources that we mentioned during the course of an episode. And we would sure appreciate it if you would give us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts and to subscribe to the podcast on whatever you use to listen to it. Both of those things really help to boost our visibility for other people who are looking for good theological content in their podcasts. And finally, if you have the means to pitch in a little bit of money to help us cover the monthly cost of hosting the audio files, you can find a donate button at meredithkline.com/podcast on the right-hand side of the page, and any amount that you can give is very much appreciated, really is encouraging. And if you don't like the PayPal option behind the donate button, you can just reach out to us at glorycloudpodcast@gmail.com and we can work something else out. But having said all of that, Todd, how should we get off the ground with our discussion of Ruth?
Well, as we said last week, we're going to slow down and work our way through this book one chapter at a time. Tonight will be a little longer because our introduction will be a little longer. So let's start with the background of the book. And really, we talked about that last week because the book begins, it was in the time of the judges. And so that's very important in the book of Ruth because the days the judges ruled, as we saw, it was a time of great apostasy and wickedness, disunity among the tribes, and God's judgment, which we talked about from Deuteronomy. We would expect God's judgment coming on the land as they were turning to idols. So there was no king yet, which means no organized leadership, no righteousness. The king would not lead the people in righteousness because there is no king. And so it's very important that you understand the time the book was written, because that will set up especially chapter 1. Now, the date of the writing, we don't know exactly when it was written. We know because David is mentioned that it would be written at least during or maybe a bit after David's reign. There's no mention of Solomon. So most scholars suggest right around the time David was king. The author is unknown. The context, and we talked about this last time, that the book of Deuteronomy is the legal background for the rest of the Old Testament in the life of Israel, the covenant God made with Israel. So if you go to chapter 28 of Deuteronomy, you see the curses that would come upon Israel if as a nation she turned away from God and worshipped idols. And what's out of all the different curses, maybe the key one is verse 24 of chapter 28. One of the curses is, "The Lord will make the rain of your land powder. From heaven dust shall come on you until you are destroyed." And so in the beginning of the book of Ruth, there's a famine in the land, which means it had not rained. So right away, verse 1 of Ruth brings you back to Deuteronomy 28:24. This is exactly what the Lord said, but notice how verse 24 ends. Until you are destroyed. And so immediately the first verse raises a question, doesn't it? And the question is God executing the curses of Deuteronomy on Israel where the promise is over? And especially the promise to Abraham. Because God promised Abraham land and seed forever. And yet we'll see that the land was taken away from Naomi. She had to leave. And then, of course, she wouldn't have sons, so the seed was taken away. And so the question of the book behind the immediate story is, have God's promises to Abraham been annulled by Israel's disobedience? That's the question the first verse raises. The curses are coming on the land, starting with famine. And so is that the end of Israel? Is that the end of God's promise to Abraham? And so that's the question that this story will answer, really in one story, but of course it's answering a much larger question than just what happens to to Naomi. But what happens to Naomi will be sort of a paradigm of what God will do for Israel. So before we get to how the story is told, any thoughts on the introduction?
I really appreciate that you tied it in to both Abraham and Sinai, because you need both of those contexts to make sense out of what's happening in the story of Ruth. I don't want to spoil the rest of our discussion, but I just appreciate that you did that.
Right, because in Abraham you have an unconditional promise, and yet to Israel you have a conditional warning, don't you?
Right, and as I think we've both pointed out in sermons on this, it makes complete sense to see the famine as involved in the curses in the law.
Exactly. So before we unpack chapter 1, I want to talk a little bit about Hebrew narrative, because this is the first time that we've dealt with a specific story. And I'm going to use material both from, I don't know if you've read How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth by Gordon Fee and Stuart Douglas.
Yes.
It's an excellent book. And it's been years since I first read it. But also insights from studying under Mark Furtado, who taught a lot in Hebrew narrative at Westminster in California. And so an anonymous writer wrote this about the book of Ruth. The book of Ruth is a Hebrew short story told with consummate skill. Among historical narratives in Scripture, it is unexcelled in its compactness, vividness, warmth, beauty, and dramatic effectiveness. An exquisitely wrought jewel of Hebrew narrative art. What do you think of that summary?
That nailed it. It is all of those things.
So what I want our listeners to see, if they've never studied Hebrew narrative before, that the way to understand doctrine, often with Hebrew narrative, is not only what it says, but in how the story is told.
Right.
And so I'm going to list some of the principles that Fee and Douglas give in their book of how to read Old Testament narrative. The first one is an Old Testament narrative usually does not directly teach a doctrine. It's a story about people. Number two, an Old Testament narrative usually illustrates a doctrine taught propositionally elsewhere. And so you can go to other parts of the Bible to have the promises explained, but here we have a story about it.
Okay.
3, narratives record what happened, not necessarily what should have happened. Not every narrative has an individual identifiable moral application. So it's not as easy to say we should do this or we shouldn't do this, because sometimes the story is simply saying what happened, not giving a moral judgment on every decision and every statement. Number 4, what people do in narratives is not necessarily a good example for us. 5, we are not always told at the end of a narrative whether what happened was good or bad. We are expected to be able to judge this on the basis of what God has taught us directly and categorically elsewhere in Scripture. And we'll see that more in chapter 2, won't we?
Yes.
Number 6, all narratives are selective and incomplete. What does appear in the narrative is everything that the inspired author thought important for us to know. And so what we're going to see is that often the theology comes out in who is speaking, who is not speaking, who is the narrator, and things like that. Number 7, narratives are not written to answer all our theological questions. They have particular, specific, limited purposes and deal with certain issues. Number 8, in the final analysis, God is the hero of all biblical narratives.
I like it.
We saw that with Genesis 27, didn't we? And
yes,
Isaac's kids and the lying that was going on and the favoritism. God was the hero in that story, not any particular character, right?
exactly.
Number 9, all narratives have 3 basic parts: characters, plot, and plot resolution.
Okay.
And we'll work our way through the plot, obviously. Remember that all Old Testament stories point ahead. And this reminds me of Geerhardus Voss describing the Bible as an unfolding flower. That each new revelation, each book, each covenant peels the flower until when you get to Revelation you have a full-bloomed flower that started in the bud of Genesis. But it's all the same story. And then finally, in Hebrew storytelling, to learn the theology, not just what is written, but who is named, who is not named, why there is repetition. Are there foils? Foils is a contrast to a character. For example, in 2 Samuel, why is Uriah over and over called Uriah the Hittite? That's very unusual. Once you've described where he's from, they don't usually keep repeating that. Usually from that point it's just a name in a story. And yet Uriah is always called the Hittite. Well, he's a foil to David because a Hittite is a Gentile. And what really is emphasized then when you keep reading that in a description is that in this particular incident, the Gentile is more righteous than the Jew.
Right.
And even the king. So even the way the story is told brings out the theology. And then in Hebrew narrative, there's always a plot. The narrative has a beginning and a middle and end. And there's dramatic tension that is eventually released. And we'll see the dramatic tension in the 4 parts of Ruth. The first 3 parts end with dramatic tension, so you'll keep reading. And then they remind you to be careful to avoid the tendency to flatten everything. Because we assume everything that God has said in His Word is directly a word to us. And thus we wrongly assume that we can simply apply it as instruction for our own lives without seeing what it meant to the original hearers, what it meant for the nation Israel, how it's fulfilled in Christ, and how it comes to us in the new covenant. Instead of directly reading Ruth, well, let's be like so-and-so and not be like so-and-so. That's flattening out. It becomes a story that doesn't even have to be historical when you do that. But history means that we can't flatten it out to a moral example. We have to see how it's fulfilled, of why it's being told. So with all that in mind, what are your thoughts on Hebrew narrative and anything you can add to sort of summarize both Fee, Stuart, and Furtado in that?
I don't know that I have anything very constructive to add other than I think Ruth is maybe the paradigm narrative. I mean, it just contains everything that they just ran through, and makes it very easy for us to talk about theology from the book of Ruth. I think a much more difficult example would be Esther. I know we're going to get there someday, but it has a plot and it has a narrative and things like that, but it just doesn't seem as easy to discern the point as it does in Ruth, to me.
Right. Yeah, that'll be fun when you get to that. growing up Jewish, I actually was the narrator for the Esther story.
Oh, really?
At Purim, which is the Jewish celebration of what's in the book of Esther. And that was I think I was 9 years old.
Oh, wow.
So I'm not bringing that narration into our study. All right, let's talk about chapter 1. And both Chris and I think our listeners may not know, have worked extensively through the book of Ruth using the Hebrew. And so we've had a lot of experience in this book. I've preached through it a number of times. So I'm sure there are things we'll leave out, but we'll try to work through it. When we're introduced to the book, we already have the historical background of the book of Judges, but the names become important. And the names are all filled with irony. And irony is one of the most common techniques in writing Hebrew narration. It's also in the New Testament, especially in the book of John. John loves irony. Culpeper has a whole book about the irony in the book of John. But you have names here that are full of irony because of what's happening. You have Bethlehem listed first. Bethlehem, the house of bread. What's the irony? There's a famine and there's no bread.
Right.
So the house of bread is breadless. And then you have the name Elimelech, which in Hebrew means God is my king, which is ironic because he's very quick to leave the promised land for Moab, a Gentile land, not acting like he's trusting God and his king. And they leave for Moab, which is ironic because Moab is a place of idol worship. Now at the time, they were at peace with Israel, so you could travel freely from one nation to the other. But to see an Israelite going east to Moab should sort of shake you a bit. That's not where they should go to live.
Right.
And of course, this reminds us of Abraham going down to Egypt and getting in trouble when there was a famine. So this brings you right back to Genesis 12. So there's irony in the names. And then Naomi means pleasant, which is ironic because through this whole first chapter, she's bitter.
Right.
She's the very opposite of pleasant. And she even calls herself, call me bitter. Change my name. So there's an upside downness to all the names. All the names are sort of the opposite of what's happening. Everything has been turned around because of Israel's rebellion into idol worship. Now, in the midst of all this irony, there is still some hope. Because even though there's a famine in the land, at least Naomi is married, right?
Right.
And so we'll go back a bit to the outline in a second after the introduction. But she does have a husband. She does have sons. Moab does have food. And so Naomi has a future. And even with Israel's famine, that doesn't seem to be the end of things, at least for Naomi. Now, I bring that up because we're going to look at the outline. There's a reason there are 4 chapters of Naomi, because there's 4 parts of this story. So the way I summarize it is, chapter 1 is Naomi's desperate situation. Chapter 2 is Naomi's potential deliverance, as Boaz is introduced. Chapter 3 is Naomi's dramatic obstacle. And chapter 4 is God's glorious solution for Naomi. Now, the common word you probably caught is Naomi.
In the book of Ruth.
In the book of Ruth. This is really a book about Naomi, from beginning to end. Ruth sort of disappears before the end, and she's not at the beginning. But this is all about Naomi. And we'll see that as we work through the story. And so we have the irony of the names, we have the curse coming on Israel, but a bit of hope for Naomi, that she's been blessed with, sons, her 2 sons. She has a husband. She's able to move to a place with food and safety. But in verses 3 through 5, everything changes. The curse increases for Naomi. Her husband dies, then her 2 sons die. Now she's a widow in a foreign land, no sons, which means no grandchildren, nobody to take care of her as she gets old. Remember, in those days, if you didn't have family to take care of you, it's very likely you could starve or definitely be misused. They're in a foreign land, and starvation was a real possibility. And so Naomi becomes as empty as Israel is under God's curse. Naomi is a picture of Israel in this story. As the curse comes on the nation, the curse very specifically comes on Naomi. And so when we read this section, verses 3 through 5, we're meant to feel for Naomi. When you're reading Old Testament stories, try your best to put yourself in the situation. Obviously, there are limits to that, but we're talking about real people. So imagine you have to leave the land you grew up with, the only land you knew, because God had turned his face away from it, or it seemed. And then your husband dies. Well, in the mourning of your husband, at least you have your children. Both your sons die, and no parent wants to see their child die before them. Both their children die and are buried. Now she's left with no possibility of a family in her mind for a future, in a foreign land, bitter and empty, feeling like God has completely abandoned her. And we would expect her to feel that way because of all the curse she's experiencing. And so already we are drawn into the story with sympathy for the main character. Any thoughts before we move on?
No, I like how you've laid that out, and I'm ready to move forward.
So the next section then is verses 6 through 14, where we learn that there's a harvest in Israel. So she has her two daughter-in-laws. Of course, her sons had married. And she heard in the fields of Moab that the Lord had visited his people and given them food. So verse 6 now is the first sign of hope, that curse of no rain was not completed. That rain came back to Israel and enough for a harvest to form, and bread was available again. And we'll see as they go back, enough time had gone, there's plenty of bread now available. Now what's interesting in verses 7 through 14 is we see the hope because of verse 6, but Naomi clearly does not feel the hope. And so she plans to walk back alone to Israel. Now if you're an elderly lady and you're walking through the hills alone, you pretty much don't care if you live or die.
Right.
We know back then there were lions, there were bandits. She was going to go back, but in her mind, she was good as dead. And so, her daughters-in-law begin to follow her, at least for a time. And Naomi instructs them to go back, which again is not really godly advice, is it?
No.
I mean, the land of promise is the land of God's presence. She should want them to come to the land of God's presence out of their idolatry. But for her to tell her daughters-in-law to go back to Moab is basically to say, go live your life of idolatry with your family and gods. In other words, she still thinks God has completely turned away from her. And she even mocks her own situation as hopeless in verses 12 and 13. Basically saying, even if I should be able to marry today, which I won't, obviously at her age, even if I could have children, which I cannot, you would have to wait until they had grown up to marry them, which you wouldn't.
Right.
In other words, my life is over. God has taken his favor away from me, and my life is done. So the best thing for you to do is to go back to Moab. Notice verse 13. The narrator comments, or she comments, that it is exceedingly bitter to me for your sake, that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me. And so on the one hand, we can see she's a little bit blind to the significance of rain returning to Israel. But on the other hand, everything she's been to, we shouldn't be too shocked that she thinks that the Lord has simply abandoned her. That's exactly how she feels. Any thoughts on that before we get to the end?
It just strikes me that the way you were setting up the book of Ruth, well, and even talking about preliminary issues, was you talked about the destruction of Israel and how that was part of the curse in the law of Moses. And so what we're learning here in verse 6 is that this famine that they were experiencing was not the destruction that was being talked about in Deuteronomy, because God is relieving it.
Right. So it is not the end of the covenant between God and Israel, nor is it God turning away from his promise to Abraham.
Right.
Which, as we've talked about before, moves beyond Israel to the new covenant. And so the surprise twist, and each of these chapters has a surprise twist. This is the dramatic storytelling that is so beautiful in Ruth. You're reading the story, and emotionally you're drawn in to Naomi's predicament. But what's not expected is Ruth. This sort of comes out of nowhere. And so notice verse 14. They weep with her. Orpah kisses her mother-in-law, but Ruth clings to her. But Orpah does what we would expect. I mean, why would she walk to a foreign land and pretty much kill herself too? She's going to go where it's safe. And yet Ruth does something very unusual. And she's pretty much giving up her own life and her own happiness here. But she won't go away from Ruth. She won't go away from her mother-in-law. And her mother-in-law has to say, see, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. And we just talked about that, right? Mm-hmm. She's even admitting that. And so why don't you return? But Ruth does something very unusual, counterintuitive, even supernatural. Do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you, for where you will go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Those are probably the most well-known words from the book of Ruth.
Right.
So what we see here is a commitment to Yahweh that had formed in Ruth as she heard the stories of God's covenant promises to Israel, which in marrying into that home she would now be familiar with. What's surprising is she believed them enough to give her life for them. And so her commitment here goes beyond simply her mother-in-law. Because notice she says, where you die, I will die. You have to assume that Naomi would die much sooner than Ruth. And so if Ruth was only committed to taking care of her mother-in-law, she would go back home afterward. But Ruth is believing in the God of Israel, and to be buried in Israel is a statement of faith. So now you have a believer, a genuine believer in this Gentile woman, and we're questioning Naomi's faith, aren't we?
Yeah, especially with all that bitterness.
Right. I mean, she's telling them to go back to their gods, and she's given up on God because she thinks God has given up on her. And yet here is Ruth out of nowhere, this Gentile, showing true covenantal faithfulness and faith in the promise of the Lord. Ready to give her own life to serve her mother-in-law, and notice how she's Christ-like in her character already. Faith produces good works, produces a change, and we see how faith produced in Ruth a life of service. But the commitment ultimately is to the Lord himself. And so we're given this twist, and we're not going to learn more about Ruth till chapter 2. But I want you to notice in verse 22 It says, so Naomi returned and Ruth the Moabite. Remember we talked about names?
Yes.
In verse 16, she's called Ruth. Very odd that later she's named as if you're just being introduced to her.
Hmm.
So again, it's that juxtaposition of the Gentile has more faith than the Israelite here.
Okay.
And so we're reminded that she's a Moabite. So even in the way the authors would name someone, you're getting theology.
Interesting.
And so in verses 19 through 22, as the chapter closes, we see that Naomi is still bitter. Verse 20, do not call me Naomi, call me Mara. Mara means bitter. For the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. She's both angry at God and believes that God either has been unfaithful to his promises or maybe has been faithful only in the sense of his curse. Not his love or forbearance or forgiveness, but she certainly believed in the curse, didn't she?
Yes.
And so as the chapter ends, Naomi is still bitter, which is odd because to the reader there are signs of hope all around her. Notice the very last word. The very last word in Ruth is harvest. So it says they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of barley harvest. That in itself is a glorious ending to chapter 1.
Yes.
They left years before because there is no harvest. Now there's abundant harvest. There's signs of hope. There's signs of God's restoration and forgiveness and love. But Naomi so far doesn't see it. Ruth believes it, but not Naomi. And also we have friends around her. And so in verse 19 we have the whole town being stirred because Naomi is back. In those days you pretty much lived in the town you grew up in. So all the ladies that knew her, she came home. So she's amongst friends. She's back in the promised land. There's harvest everywhere. She has a daughter-in-law with genuine faith. All these signs of hope, but Naomi is still blind to it. So as we end chapter 1, our response to Naomi is still some sympathy, right?
Oh, sure. We can identify with Naomi.
Yeah, I think even us as Christians, when we go through hard time after hard time, we sometimes feel the way Naomi does, don't we?
Mm-hmm.
So our response is, when we end the chapter, we have sympathy for Naomi. We have hope because of the positive way the chapter ends. We're somewhat frustrated that Naomi doesn't see all the signs of God's grace. She doesn't seem to appreciate Ruth at all.
Right.
And so all these emotions run through us. We're drawn into the story, but we, again, identify somewhat with Naomi. But we end with some hope in God. We want to turn the page because it ends with, this isn't the end. And so we're left with this dramatic tension at the end of each chapter, at the end of each part. And so the question would be, is Naomi going to believe? What's Ruth's place in all this? Is it true that God has changed his mind about Israel? What's going on? And so the plot thickens, the tension is not resolved. There's a temporary tension resolved, and Naomi's back in the land and she gets to eat. But the ultimate tensions in the book you have to read on. And it was written that way. So you would read on and be drawn into it. And of course the bigger question is about God and Israel. So we'll end it there with chapter 1. Let me just say, chapter 2, I noticed that Aimee Byrd in her book that everyone's been talking about has gotten a lot of flack for suggesting that in Ruth chapter 2 there's sexual tension going on between Boaz and Ruth. Is that actually accurate? Is that true? We'll talk about that next week because it's a very uncomfortable story in chapter 2.
Right.
But I know you've worked through chapter 1 before, so I know you have thoughts and insights, so let me have them.
Well, I mean, actually, most of my focus was on chapter 2, so I'm really looking forward to next week. But I have preached on chapter 1, and I wish that we had this conversation before I preached, because I could have tied it in better with redemptive history. I do want to plug a book that I discovered during my time in seminary. Anyone else who wants to work through Ruth might find this beneficial as well. The book's title is Literary Interpretations of Biblical Narratives, the Bible in Literature Courses series. And there's one chapter in this book by a D.F. Rauber on the book of Ruth. And in his one chapter, he just gives some brief sketches of each chapter and the theme for that chapter as he sees it. I'm not even sure that Rauber is a believer, but the theological themes that he picks up on are tremendously suggestive. So you definitely get the emptiness, fullness motif going on in chapter 1 here. And wow, that has to be tied into Israel's own emptiness, especially when you understand that emptiness in terms of the curse of the law in Deuteronomy, and how the promise that God made to Abraham is ultimately what's going to be the salvation for anybody that we're reading about. So I got the emptiness and fullness part, but I wish I had tied it in better with Abraham and Moses.
Yeah, as you know, there are a lot of connections between Naomi and Abraham.
Yes.
And so especially when you consider the answer to both of them, at least in a local temporary sense, was a child.
Mm-hmm.
And so while you have the birth of Isaac, when they were barren, they were experiencing the curse of barrenness. You have a similar thing with Naomi. And then at the end of chapter 4, a baby is placed in her lap. And so Israel was to identify Naomi's story going back to Abraham and tying this together to God's covenant faithfulness.
Wow.
So there's a lot of there's a lot of connections between, and we'll look at those as we... would you put that book in the show notes?
Absolutely. Yep. It may be out of print, but I'll find what I can and I'll link it in the show notes.
I haven't read it. I'd love to order it unless it's like $200. Some of these out of print books.
It's possible also that I have a photocopy of that chapter. So if it's just outrageous in price, then I can try to make that photocopy available.
All right. So we will continue chapter 2 next week.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. I learned a lot from that, and I appreciate it very much.
Thank you.
All right. Well, we would love to hear what you think, so please do email us at glorycloudpodcast@gmail.com. You can tweet at us. I am at MachenGuy. Todd is at tbordeaux. The podcast itself is at glorycloudpod. I'm also on Instagram as at MachenGuy. But you can also join the discussion over at the Meredith Kline Facebook group. Just let the admins know that you listen to the podcast, and they can get you added. And Todd and I will be back again next week with chapter 2 of Ruth, so don't miss that.